She walked into the courtroom a grieving widow, holding nothing but truth and a photo of the man she lost. He walked in wearing a $1,000 suit, head of the company that caused her husband's death. Everyone expected a war. What no one saw coming was what happened next. Because sometimes justice doesn't just punish, it redeems, and a man with everything to lose learns what it means to feel again. Welcome back to the channel where the rich meet the broken. And one moment changes everything. Love, loss, redemption, all in one story. If this story already has you leaning in, hit that subscribe button. Here we tell stories that don't just pass time. They reach your heart. Stay with us, because this one, it's going to stay with you. Please kindly take me to 1,000 subscribers. Grace wasn't rich. She didn't live in a big house. But she had something better. A good man, a little boy, and a simple life full of love. Her husband Daniel worked hard, sometimes too hard. He was a foreman for one of the biggest construction firms in the country. It didn't pay much, but it paid enough to keep the lights on and food on the table. Every morning before sunrise, Daniel kissed Grace's forehead, packed his lunch and whispered, "I'll be home by dinner, baby." And every night he was, until the night he wasn't. One Tuesday afternoon, Grace got a call that shattered her entire world. Daniel's sight had collapsed. The steel structure gave way. There were injuries, fatal ones. Daniel was one of them. Grace's knees gave out. Her son Noah stood frozen as his mother screamed on the kitchen floor. They buried Daniel 3 days later. But grief wasn't the only thing that showed up after the funeral. So did the medical bills, the funeral costs, the eviction notice. Cross Enterprises, the billion-dollar company behind the project, sent flowers. No call, no apology, no explanation, just silence. Grace waited and waited until something inside her broke and then woke up. She looked down at her son sleeping on the couch in his dad's old sweatshirt and said, "No, we're not letting him die for nothing." She didn't have a lawyer. She didn't have money. All she had was the truth. And the fire of a mother who refuses to let her child grow up, thinking the world doesn't care. She filed a lawsuit, and the world began to watch. Grace had never stepped foot in a courtroom before, but now she was walking into one alone. No camera crews, no fancy suits, just a small woman in worn heels carrying a cheap leather folder and a picture of her husband in her purse. The moment she filed the lawsuit, people whispered, "She doesn't stand a chance. You can't go after a man like him. Julian Cross? He has 10 lawyers on retainer before breakfast." They were right. Julian Cross was everything Grace wasn't. He had power, private jets, and a legal team that made grown men cry in depositions. But Grace had something his empire didn't. The truth. Her lawyer, Ben, was young, barely out of law school. He didn't wear Armani. He wore wrinkles from working 3 jobs to pay off student debt. But he believed her. "They think this will be over in a day," he said quietly. "Let's make them sit through every second." The courtroom was cold, white walls, polished floors, and faces that didn't care, until Grace stood up. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She simply told the story of a man who died doing his job because someone rich decided to cut corners. "My husband didn't just fall," she said. "He was failed. And someone has to say it out loud." At first, the judge barely looked up. The defense team scribbled in silence. And Julian Cross, he wasn't even there. Just a name on paper. Just another CEO hiding behind glass towers. But something about the way Grace spoke, the way she didn't ask for sympathy, only accountability, started to echo through that cold wooden room. This wasn't about money. This was about dignity, truth, and what happens when the little guy finally says enough. The first hearing ended in silence. The press barely mentioned it. But someone at Cross Enterprises sent a message up the chain. "You might want to show up next time. This woman, she's not going away." And for the first time in 10 years, Julian Cross looked up from his desk. The courtroom was busier than usual that morning. Reporters gathered in the back row. Not many, but just enough to make Grace's hands shake as she clutched her file. She wasn't trying to become a headline. She was just trying to be heard. "Are you ready?" her lawyer asked softly. Grace nodded. But truthfully, she wasn't, because today he was coming. Julian Cross. The billionaire, the man whose company let her husband die. The man who never sent a letter, never made a call, never showed his face. Until now, the door opened. No cameras flashed. No one gasped. But Grace could feel the air shift. He walked in slowly, like the courtroom belonged to him. Expensive suit, polished shoes, calm, unreadable face. But when his eyes landed on her just for a second, something flickered. Not arrogance, not pity, confusion, maybe even regret. Grace didn't flinch. She looked right back, not with anger, but with something heavier. Truth, loss, a pain that demanded to be seen. Julian sat down. He didn't speak. He didn't even glance at his lawyers. Because something about Grace, the way she held herself, the photograph on the table in front of her, the little boy's drawing sticking out of her purse, it rattled something in him. Something he'd buried under contracts, quarterly earnings, and silence. She wasn't just the widow. She was a mother, a wife, someone who lost everything because he wasn't watching closely enough. And for the first time in years, Julian Cross felt something break open in his chest. This wasn't just business anymore. This was about a woman who refused to be invisible, even when the whole world had moved on. By the end of that week, Grace's name was everywhere, not because she asked for it, not because she chased the spotlight, but because the story hit a nerve. A widow, a child, a silent billionaire. The perfect headline for a world hungry for outrage. Widow takes on billionaire CEO. Grieving mother sues Cross Enterprises. Who is Julian Cross and why is he hiding? Grace hated the attention. She never wanted her husband's death to become a trending topic. But she couldn't stop it now. People started showing up outside the courthouse. Some brought signs that said justice for Daniel. Others just wanted to see the billionaire in the suit, and the woman brave enough to challenge him. Julian Cross saw it all unfold. From the back seat of a black SUV, behind tinted windows. He didn't flinch at bad press. He'd been accused of worse. But this time, something felt different. The articles didn't paint Grace as angry or greedy. They painted her as human, as a woman doing what anyone would do if they lost someone and no one said sorry. For the first time in his career, Julian didn't ask his PR team to spin it. He told them to let it run. Let people hear her, he said quietly. I should have listened a long time ago. Behind the boardroom doors, his partners were furious. They begged him to settle, to silence her with money. Pay her and make it go away, one executive said. You're making this worse. But Julian didn't want to make it go away. He wanted to understand it, so he kept showing up in court. He watched her speak. He listened as her son's drawings were entered into evidence. As Grace read aloud the final voicemail Daniel left her before the accident. And somewhere in the middle of it all, the cold, distant billionaire started to feel something he couldn't explain. Guilt, respect, maybe even admiration. This woman wasn't just holding his company accountable. She was holding him accountable, not with hate, but with honesty. And Julian Cross realized, sometimes the headlines get it wrong. But this time, maybe they didn't. It was a cold Sunday morning when Grace went to the cemetery. She didn't go every day, not anymore. But sometimes, the weight in her chest got too heavy, and the only place she could breathe was at Daniel's grave. She brought fresh flowers. Nothing fancy. Just daisies, his favorite, even though he never admitted it. Her son Noah stayed home with her sister. She needed this moment alone. As she walked toward the familiar headstone, she noticed something strange. Someone was already there, a tall man, alone, wearing a long black coat, standing with his back to her. At first, she thought it was a stranger, maybe another grieving soul visiting someone nearby. But then she saw it, the monogrammed initials on the sleeve. The perfectly polished shoes that didn't belong in the dirt. Julian Cross. Grace stopped in her tracks. What was he doing here? He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there looking down at the grave. No press, no security, no lawyers whispering in his ear. Just a man. Look, not the kind of tired from work, but the kind that comes from finally feeling what you tried so hard to avoid. She didn't approach. She just stood there holding the flowers. Her heart caught between anger and understanding. Julian stood up. turned. Their eyes met. No words, no apology, but in his eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen in court. Grief, guilt, humanity. He nodded. A simple, silent gesture that said, "I know now. I'm not running anymore." Then he walked away. Grace stepped forward, laid the daisies beside the envelope, and whispered, "Thank you for finally seeing him." That was the first time she realized. Julian Cross wasn't just the man she was suing. He was the man trying to find a piece of his soul he lost. In the silence, the courtroom was silent. The kind of silence that wraps around your chest and makes it hard to breathe. Grace held her breath as the judge looked down at the final papers. Her fingers trembled under the table. Across the room, Julian Cross sat still, his expression unreadable. It had been months of hearings, statements, and headlines. Months of reliving the worst day of her life over and over, all for this moment. The judge cleared his throat. In the matter of Carter vs. Cross Enterprises, this court finds in favor of the plaintiff. Grace didn't move. Not at first. It took a moment for the words to land, and when they did, she closed her eyes. Not in victory, but in relief. She hadn't done this for money. She did it so her husband's name wouldn't be forgotten, so her son would grow up knowing his father didn't just die on the job. He mattered. She didn't cry until she heard Noah whisper behind her, "Mommy, does this mean Daddy was right?" Her voice cracked. "Yeah, baby, he was." The courtroom slowly emptied. Lawyers packed up, reporters scribbled quotes, and camera crews waited outside for a statement she wasn't ready to give. But Julian Cross didn't leave. He walked toward her slowly, carefully, like a man carrying weight he didn't know how to name. He didn't bring flowers. He didn't offer a check. He didn't try to make it about himself. He simply looked her in the eyes and said 3 words. "I'm sorry." Not rehearsed, not performative, just real. Grace stared at him, unsure what to say, because in all her dreams about this day, she had imagined so many versions of Julian Cross. But she never imagined this one, a man standing with nothing to prove and everything to take responsibility for. She nodded, not because everything was okay, but because she saw what so few people get to see from the powerful: accountability. Julian stepped back and added quietly, "I know it won't fix anything, but I'd like to do something in Daniel's name. Not for cameras, just for him." Grace didn't answer, but for the first time since the trial began, she saw him not as the billionaire who failed her, but the man who might finally be trying to make things right. Weeks passed after the verdict. No reporters, no cameras, no headlines, just life. Grace went back to her small job at the school library. Noah started smiling more. The world didn't change overnight, but inside their little apartment, it felt lighter. Then one afternoon, a package arrived. It wasn't from a lawyer. It wasn't a check. Inside was a single letter and a photograph. The photo showed a construction site, freshly built, clean, safe. At the gate was a plaque that read, "The Daniel Carter Youth Center, funded by Cross Foundation, in memory of those we should never forget." The letter was short. "For your husband, for your son, for every man who deserved better than what I gave. I know this doesn't erase the past, but I hope it builds something for the future." Julian. Grace sat on the edge of her bed, letter in hand, heart aching in a different way. She hadn't seen Julian since court, but his actions kept speaking even in silence. She visited the center a week later. To her surprise, Julian was there. No press, no staff, just him, sitting on the steps, sleeves rolled up, helping install bookshelves. He stood when he saw her. "Didn't think you'd come. Didn't think you'd still be working," she smiled. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't romantic. It was something better. Honest, quiet, real. They talked for hours. About Daniel, about Noah, about the nights Julian couldn't sleep, because he finally realized what power without purpose felt like. Over time, those conversations turned into friendship. And that friendship, slowly, carefully, turned into something deeper. Not a fairy tale, but a new beginning. He didn't try to fix her, and she didn't ask him to save her. Instead, they both learned to sit with the parts of life that hurt and hold space for something gentler than grief. Love didn't come all at once. It came in coffee cups, in building blocks at the youth center, in the way Julian smiled when Noah called him Mr. Jules. Grace once walked into a courtroom seeking justice. She walked out not just with a verdict, but with a new kind of hope. And Julian Cross, he finally understood. Sometimes the heart learns what wealth never could. They say the courtroom is where justice lives. But for Grace and Julian, it became the place where healing started. She didn't just win the case. She reclaimed her voice. Her son reclaimed his father's name. And Julian Cross, once the cold face of power, learned to feel again. Not through money, but through honesty, through grief, and finally, through love. Because sometimes the most unexpected people are the ones who help us put our lives back together. If this story touched something in you, don't just scroll away. Hit that subscribe button and join us for more stories that speak to the heart. Every week, we share emotional journeys about loss, hope, and the quiet strength of everyday people. You're not just watching, you're becoming part of something real.